As Arnold just pointed out, President Bouteflika entered office 20 years ago. About half of Algeria's population has known no other leader. William Lawrence is a professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University. He actually wrote his dissertation back in 2004 about Algeria and some of the protests you witnessed then. I mean, is this deja vu all over again for you?
Absolutely. It's been very interesting to watch these protest crowds growing every Friday since February 16th when the protest started, which wasn't a Friday. And we have protest slogans from the 60s, from the 80s, from the 90s, from the 2000s, sort of a greatest hits of Algerian contestation. And the sheer diversity of protests means that sort of every aspect of Algerian society has joined in. I mean, the size of the crowds has just been incredible in the millions, and we haven't seen something like this not only in Algeria, in any other Arab country of this size.
But somebody's listening for this to happen. I mean, clearly you have a leader who's incapacitated. I mean, when was the last time he spoke to his civilians?
Not since his stroke in 2013, and he's had several strokes. In fact, when he came back from Geneva a few weeks ago, we weren't sure if he was going to come back dead or alive. And it's just amazing that you've had a leader of a country this incapacitated for this long without a replacement.
So what does that say about Algeria?
That they couldn't figure out who the successor should be, and there's been basically a successor struggle going on. And what the protest crowds have done, among other things, is force a resolution of a 6-year-old succession discussion.
So talk to me about why now. Do you think it's just because we've reached such a height with the demonstrations they had to do something?
Well, because he was going for a 5th mandate, and that's just too much. I mean, after his stroke, he ran for president in 2014 without giving a speech. And so, you know, a year after stroke, that made some sense. He's sort of the last man standing from the revolution of 54-62. And even now, today, people are talking about letting him go with dignity. The problem is 6 years later, what's the dignified exit? And now we have his closest ally in the security services saying he needs to go. So he set in motion an eventual departure, but it's just incredible that it's taken this long for all of Algeria to agree that it's time for the president to step down.
Now, the Constitutional Council will have to sign off on this, and initially they laughed off the protesters, kind of didn't take them seriously. Yeah. Can we expect them to sign off on it? I mean, what do you see as the next step in all of this?
So obviously, what the army wants is a constitutional transition, which is fine until you realize that the whole system is stacked to preserve the system. The protesters have basically had two demands. Bouteflika step down and change the system. But when you ask the protesters, what system do you want to live under, obviously, there's a whole conversation there that isn't happening about what Algeria could be. And so into that void of leadership and messaging, or diversity of messaging, the regime comes in and says, well, we have a way to replace the president and preserve the system, the very system that they all want change. And so that's the dance that's going on. And the question is, how many Algerians in privileged positions will be able to keep those privileged positions? And if you have a transition, for example, how many trials about corruption are you going to have? You know, who are going to have to be the fall guys in order for others to maintain a certain privileged position in a society that's very rich with oil and gas wealth?
This 82-year-old leader, incapacitated, obviously will have to exit stage right. How will he be remembered?
I think fondly by a lot of Algerians, because he was the youngest minister of the revolution generation of 62. He came back at a very critical time in Algerian history towards the end of their decade of civil war in the 90s, in which 200,000 Algerians died and millions were injured and displaced. And he was symbolic of the reconciliation that Algerians desired and started down the path of after the war. The problem is that the reconciliation never really fully happened, and increasingly over the years, in order to maintain power, the president aligned with harder and harder sort of factions within the military and security services, and that made him gradually less popular. So, but again, what Algerians want is for him to exit gracefully and with dignity.
Well, William Lawrence, we will keep our eye on it. Thank you so much for your analysis. Appreciate it.